There are certain pieces of folklore that are never forgotten, or persons of folklore. There was one such individual in Connecticut, so well wandered in its backwoods, he became synonymous with the state. When asked his name, the strange vagabond refused to give it. So, due to his odd outfit, the people called him Leatherman, or Leathery. Often, old was added to the title as a sort of honorific, as the raggedy, dirty wanderer seemed to be rather advanced in age when he first appeared. Though, when pressed about his age, the soft-spoken fellow would write 15342 or some such string of numbers out on a piece of paper. Other times he would only grunt, then move on as always. There was very little physically remarkable about Old Leathery. He was not deformed, crippled, or insane, though perhaps a bit awkward, but people were always interested in him. His physical descriptions were everyday: 5 foot 7 inches tall, black hair, blue eyes, and he likely weighed only about 160 pounds, without his famous leather coat. The greatcoat itself weighed about 60 pounds alone. His only physical deformity was a cancerous sore that appeared on his lip in the last years of his long life. What was so fascinating about the Leatherman was the circuit he ran through New York and Connecticut, a rambling loop he started in the 1850s, which slowly tightened over the decades. By 1880 or 82, people in towns along the Leatherman's route could set their watches by his arrival. Until his death in 1889, he would appear every 34 days in each town along the Leatherman's loop, where he knew friendly people would feed him. Even though some of the Leatherman's friends met him dozens of times throughout his life, they rarely asked questions about him and never received answers. The Leatherman, his life, and reasons for his wanderings were an honest-to-God mystery even in the 1800s. And it remains so to this day. There are no easy answers with the Old Leatherman, but few have ever wanted them. Throughout the decades, there has been no end of interest in the Leatherman or his journey. In a way, it was the incompleteness of his wanderings that made him immortal. By the 1850s, America was approaching the crossroads of the Civil War, but it was also much more of a nation than it was before. The national divide proved there was an American identity and a battle to be had over it. People became introspective of the idea of the United States as a singular nation. A national consciousness produced the desire for both national and local folklore, an idea all the more intense after the conclusion of the Civil War. In the Northeast, industrialization and an influx of French-Canadian immigrants seemed to make this all the more pressing. By the end of the Civil War, the roads were full of migrants, returning soldiers, and simply wanderers looking for work. Those without a home rambled from city to city looking for any charity that could be had. By the end of the 1860s, national poverty was crushing. Even in the most rural states, vagabonds were a common sight. The Leatherman actually predated these migrations across the nation. He likely arrived in New England with the first waves of French-Canadian immigrants from Quebec in the mid-1850s. First sightings of a leather-clad individual place his appearance at 1858 or so, about 3 years prior to the Civil War. Why he chose to roam in Connecticut, New York is unknown. In the 1860s and 1870s, there were reports of him tramping as far north as the Berkshires in western Massachusetts and well into Vermont. Either way, as people took to the country roads in the 1860s, the Leatherman was caught up in their number. The tramp problem, as it was called at the time, is often forgotten, a national crisis if anything. A problem only made worse by chaos following the Civil War. Economic migrants, displaced Southerners, and impoverished soldiers crowded the gutters. Legally, the federal government declared that each town was responsible for vagrants after they spent more than 3 months in town, a standard called legal settlement. This meant vagabonds had to keep moving, or risk being ejected from towns, imprisoned, or disappeared. The public raised solutions to the tramp problem that, today, seem rather brutal. Workhouses were the most common, but others suggested poisoning them like rats with food, forced resettlement, or outright execution. By the 1870s, tramp laws were being instated for the public good. Luckily, the public often simply gave the beggars food and sent them on their way, never wanting to harm them. Most would never show up in town again, except the Leatherman, that is. Though never legally exempt from the tramp laws, the codes were never enforced on the Leatherman, because he was largely harmless and predated the laws. Newspaper accounts place his first appearance at Hawinton, Connecticut in 1858, but these already address him as a familiar sight in the area. Oral accounts suggest he had been tramping about New England for years prior. well established before the Civil War in 1861. It was not until the 1860s, though, the press realized there was an interest in this man clothed all in leather, interest not quelled by the fact he spoke little, often stammering in accented English when he did speak. When asked questions, he answered in single words or silence, then simply continued walking on the road. While at first feared for his massive leather suit that made him appear monstrous, the Leatherman was meek and soft-spoken. He preferred to be left alone, but was not in any way malicious. He would allow people to follow him, but nobody could convince him to stay or even come inside. In nearly all the towns along his route, Old Leathery was tolerated, if not outright welcomed. Before he arrived, wives would prepare meals and bread for him. Meals he always took outside, due to the fact he hated to come into houses, but also because he was said to stink, horses and dogs often startled by his smell. Eventually, there emerged an informal group of friends to the Leatherman, houses he would always call upon for meals in the towns he visited. By the 1880s, and likely earlier, the Leatherman was surviving purely off the food provided to him by his friends. Whenever he was harassed, the friends pressed the police of any town to arrest the often drunken offenders, despite the fact, in most of the cases, no crime was ever committed on the Leatherman, and he was always unfazed. A strong stoic. Chauncey L. Hotchkiss of Bristol, Connecticut, an established friend of the Leatherman, even became the first Leatherman expert. Among the friends, Hotchkiss established a mail ring to track the Leatherman's movements across New York and Connecticut. Hotchkiss was able to map the Leatherman's route through the two states in 1885, establishing it was about a general 360 or 366-mile circuit that often varied. Not that it was hard to track the local icon. He was a well-established mainstay in more than 40 towns. On the road, his coat was often sighted before him, a massive, handcrafted construct of leather that predated the Leatherman's wanderings. Often so heavy and caked with dirt, the Leatherman required a tanner to oil the greatcoat for him, his heavy bag much the same. When either needed fixing, the Leatherman would accept donations from tanneries or take leather off old boots. When a concerned housewife offered him boots for his travels, Leathery responded by cutting off the leather and returning the, now useless, soles to her, much to her shock. Experts declared the 60-pound long coat an expertly crafted oddity. It was cold in the winter and hot in the summer, but bound together in the way only an expert could do. Despite his self-imposed poverty, Leatherman clearly had a talent with his namesake material. Sadly, though, the coat was destroyed in a museum fire in New York in 1928. But many recreations remain to this day. Today, then, we are lucky to have more than 20 photos of Connecticut's famous vagabond and his legendary coat. As the Wanderer notoriously hated photographs. Nearly all of them were taken by surprise or from a distance as the Leatherman fled from the sight of cameras. Until most were collected by Dan DeLuca in the 2000s, the photos floated about family collections as heirloom mementos of the Leatherman. Even a portrait of the Leatherman was painted by A.V. Durant in 1892, which now hangs in the Derby Public Library. For the folklore of Connecticut, the Leatherman's image was important, pictures, paintings, and woodcuts. Along his route, stores would even use his likeness and silhouette in ads. He never complained or sued for copyright infringement. The Leatherman was hard to read. When confronted on the road, he would often pretend to not understand English or be mute. For ladies in carriages, though, he would always move out of the way. When offered anything, he would always refuse, except leather and tobacco. The Leatherman was a fierce smoker even for his time, likely due to his hard-weather lifestyle, and would always scrounge up tobacco for his handcrafted pipe, either from his friends or discarded cigars he found on the side of the street. Smoking and silence were his only two vices. Nor did he ever display any ill will towards anything. If harassed in a town, he would simply never return to it, a reason he always avoided population centers. He seems to have acquired money somehow, but never worked or took donations. When children gave him coins, he would polish them and then return them to the child. He was always kind to children and animals, though animals did not seem to like him very much. It was children, too, who first discovered his hidey holes in local caves. What was the reason for the Leatherman's strange behavior and wanderings? Without a clear origins, scholars can only guess. Anything about the Leatherman is mostly unsubstantiated guesswork off the little information we know for sure about him. The Leatherman could speak English, though in a heavy French accent, and he was able to read and write. So unfamiliarness with English or poor education does not explain his habits. Insanity was a common accusation in his time, but the Leatherman's survival ability was unmatched, so he was clearly competent in that regard. Some degree of social anxiety or autism may explain his odd behavior, which others took as guilt or insanity. The Leatherman avoided unnecessary conversation and entering closed spaces with others. His massive coat perhaps meant to prevent people from touching him. It would also explain his avoidance of cities and refusal to board in houses. On his own origins, the Leatherman was always mum. The Leatherman's Frenchness is the only obvious clue. His English was heavily accented, and he would actually hold conversations in French. French-Canadian servants in the region were known to have longer than usual conversations with him. Other evidence suggests the Leatherman was Catholic. He refused to eat meat on Fridays, kept a small Angus Day, Lamb of God, cross around his neck, and owned an old French prayer book. He never attended any of the churches along his route, and nobody ever saw him pray. He likely came from Quebec, though contemporary rumors suggest Picardy, France. When forced to talk in English, he used few words, monosyllables such as yes, no, food. After his providers warmed to him, he would not even speak at all, and only pantomime, pointing to his mouth to eat or motioning to coffee, which he loved to drink. Those who were close to the Leatherman often remarked on his swarthy complexion, some suggesting he was partially Indian or black, though, as he literally never bathed, surface-level observations were dirty and debatable. The only common observation was he looked old. No matter where, people saw his craggy, bearded face as old. In actuality, the Leatherman was likely not that advanced in age. Modern Leatherman scholar Dan DeLuca believed the Leatherman was probably born around 1839, as medical experts observed that he was only around 50 when he was found dead in 1889. That would make the Leatherman only about 20 when he first appeared in the 1850s. If the Quebec thesis is correct, the Leatherman was definitely French-Canadian. DeLuca believed him to be part Native American due to his survival skills. Perhaps he often traveled back to Canada early on in his career to visit his Indian grandfather. If DeLuca's beliefs are correct, then the Leatherman settled into his famous route between 1883 and 1889 only due to his grandfather's death. Other circumstantial evidence in Quebec suggests the Leatherman was a Quebecois of some variety. In the mid-1800s, there was an area famous for leather production known as Les Tanneries in St. Henry, Quebec, perhaps where the Leatherman hailed from and learned his trade. Tanners were common in the settlement and leather production its main industry, St. Henry itself being not too distant from either New York or Connecticut. The Leatherman's shoes, too, support a French-derived origin. His footwear was known for its wooden soles, which made them more like clogs, a form of leather shoecraft common among the peasants of northern France and Belgium. Wood, too, served a utilitarian purpose of being both durable and plentiful in the region. The Leatherman would only stop a few hours a day to rest. Rarely was he ever seen to lounge. To keep his self-appointed 34-day cycle, he had to move constantly through any type of weather. The Leatherman was so punctual with his schedule that when he was even a few hours off, people thought he died. Not even New England's fierce snows could stop him either. The legendary blizzard of 1888, which killed hundreds and shut businesses for days, with almost 50 inches of snow in Connecticut, barely impacted the Leatherman. It only delayed him by about 4 days. Old Leathery is thought to have waited it out in a cave. After it stopped, he trekked out through the snow. Despite its commonplace nature after decades, the Leatherman's arrival in some towns always became a celebration. Groups would gather to watch his entrance and attempt to speak with him. The Leatherman ignored them and continued on to the next house that would feed him. Leatherman days were well known in the schools along his route. Teachers would let students out early or reward them with half-days to go see the Leatherman when he came to town. He always tolerated the interest of youngsters, but never spoke back. Few perhaps realized how well-known the Leatherman was beyond their townships. The Leatherman trekked a good deal of Connecticut and Westchester, Putnam County of New York. About 240 miles of his 365-mile journey through Connecticut and 125 through New York. Hotchkiss's 1885 map offers an idea of the path, but it was in no way static. The Leatherman would add and subtract towns as he pleased, and depending on his reception in them. Generally, the vagabond would always move clockwise, though. Then, by 1883, he stuck purely to Connecticut and New York due to his declining health. It would be impossible to list every town the Leatherman visited in his journeys, but he was a mainstay in more than 40 in the region. He'd travel through Saybrook, Stratford, New Canaan, Greenwich, White Plains, Ossining, Bedford Hills, Yorktown, Somers, North Salem, Danbury, Bridgewater, and many others. A timetable taken at the Forestville Post Office in 1884 shows how insanely punctual the Leatherman was. He made visits to the town in every month except August, due to his 34-day cycle. The earliest he ever passed the post office was at 1:45 p.m. The latest? 3:35 p.m. That's not even a 2-hour difference. The curious hobo had gotten his arrival and exits down to a near science. Not to say the Leatherman's life was easy, but he did not seem to desire any more. Refusing to stay in houses, he lived in caves, constructed lean-tos, or simply slept on the side of the road. When asked if he was cold, he would say no, or grumble, "at a fire." His survival skills were top-notch, many suggesting he was familiar with Indian lore due to his ability to live off the land, an assumption seemingly vindicated when 3 different herb gardens planted by the Leatherman were found by 3 different caves along his route. Though there are no accounts of him hunting, the Leatherman undoubtedly did, at least early on to provide food and leather for his journey. Leathery knew how to tan hides naturally, and several people recalled witnessing him tan deer hides in caves, signs of aptitude with tanning as an artwork. How educated the Leatherman exactly was is a common topic of debate. Supposedly, the Leatherman once carried 2 books of charts and symbols in his massive bag. On the very rare occasions he displayed them, witnesses claimed they appeared to be abstract depictions of his travels, though claims vary about their exact purpose, likely logs or catalogs of some sort. While his meager belongings were found after his death, these 2 books were not among them. Were they lost, destroyed, or simply never existed? Impossible to say. Among his possessions were a French prayer book printed 1844, a handcrafted pipe, a hatchet, a small tin pail, a small spider, object used to suspend a pan above an open fire, 3 jackknives, in all, and the Catholic crucifix he wore on his neck. Beneath the massive jacket, his only underclothing was a knit woolen jacket. None of the objects provide anywhere near the insight the rumored journals could have, though. Perhaps that is for the better. The Leatherman took whatever secrecy he had to his grave. After the blizzard of 1888, the sore on the Leatherman's lip grew worse from exposure. Within a few months, it was cancerous, and the Leatherman could barely eat. The only way he could was by crushing up his food into coffee, which he drank as a sort of slop. The meals of his last few months often consisting of 6 or more cups of mush. A miserable sight, there was outcry for doctors to examine Old Leathery, or at least have him housed for the winter. But, as always, the Leatherman refused. In December of 1888, then, Agent Richard Dzeng of the Hartford Humane Society was sent after him, the only case where the Leatherman was arrested by authorities in his entire life, though the Humane Society only planned to examine him at the hospital for the winter. When the agents turned the Leatherman over to the hospital, he offered, or the doctors recorded, his name as Zacharias Bouvier, though if there was any truth to this identity is unknown. Once the agents left, the Leatherman asked to leave the hospital. Having no real legal power to keep him, the doctors begrudgingly obliged. The Leatherman returned to his wanderings. The agents never again made another play at him. Either way, the Leatherman's last months of freedom were brief, but they were free. On March 24th, 1889, the Leatherman's body was found in the Sawmill Woods cave in Mount Pleasant on the Georgedale farm. He had been dead for days. When taken to the mortuary, the coroners deemed the cause of death as blood poisoning from cancer, not helped by a state of near starvation. The date of death registered as March 20th. His death certificate only read Leatherman. By March 30th, the news rang out that the vagabond was dead. Afterwards, the Leatherman's body was conveyed to Austin, New York, where it received burial in Sparta Cemetery. Despite being consigned to a pauper's grave, hundreds attended the funeral. The loss only piqued interest in him, though. The allure he had in life now multiplied as people sought to stitch together his story, or find the legendary Leatherman's treasure. Both proved impossible. This leathermania was goaded on by popular appeal of wanderers in American folklore, and the Leatherman emerged as a sort of wandering Jew figure in American mythology, if not an outright stand-in. Some towns called him Leatherman, others his leatherness or his aloofness. In Waterbury, he was known as Good Coffee for his famous terse opinions as he ate, but he was a sort of celebrity in all of them. Newspapers reprinted every rumor and fiction they could about him. Some claimed he was a religious ascetic, others he was a wealthy miser, and some that his route was a self-imposed exile. It was always said, though, he was a native of a foreign country, had met with great trouble and disappointment, and ever since had been a wanderer upon the face of the earth. Or, as James F. Rogers, one of the few to photograph the Leatherman, wrote on the vagabond's public image, "Maiden ladies unanimously agree that the Leatherman has been disappointed in love, but shudder when they think who could ever have been infatuated by so repulsive a being. Others ascribe his wandering and adherence to silence to those of a lunatic who despises humanity and seeks to gratify his unknown longing by these never-ending journeys. Misers, whom the old man seems to know and avoid by instinct, say he has vast quantities of gold and jewels hidden away in the dark recesses of some cave. All are creations of the imagination, existing only in their author's mind. But the Leatherman is indeed an enigma of humanity rarely to be met with. None save the weird, subtle genius of Hawthorne could do him justice in romance, and Dickens, with his inimitable faculty of description, would have found him a study, while Doyle, with all his uncouth grotesqueness of imagery, has scarcely conceived a more repulsive being. To those who have seen him, any description would be weak and impotent, but to the unacquainted reader it may not be amiss to endeavour to transcribe the picture my memory retains of him. From the instant of his death, the debate over the Leatherman's true identity began. There have been many names proposed, but none have ever been satisfactory. Nearly all are, or are almost, fiction. The most persistent name attached to the Leatherman is Jules Bourglet, the name once engraved on his tombstone. A total invention, though. A mix of urban legends published in a semi-fictional article in the Waterbury Daily American on August 16, 1884. The article was by a W.A. Salson, pen name of tanner and financial agent William A. Gordon, as a fiction. The Waterbury Daily even has retracted it several times throughout the years, but the story has persisted despite the paper's denial. Dan DeLuca was even able to prove the story was outright fiction when he found letters from the writer declaring it a story based on the popular legends about the Leatherman. Perhaps the reason for the name's persistence in popular imagination is due to its association with one of the more popular Leatherman romances. Fanciful campfire stories told by townsfolk about the Leatherman's mysterious origin. A claim perhaps bolstered when an unexplained French agent named Jules Martin came searching for a Mr. Bourglet in the Northeast in 1887. The backstory of Mr. Jules Bourglet varies, but often invokes some mixture of failed merchants, lost loves, and insanity. As the only extant Leatherman documentary attempted to synthesize in 1887 with excellent narration.
It was written that the Leatherman was Jules Bourglet of Lyon, France, the son of a carpenter. He fell in love with Margaret Laurent, the daughter of a wealthy leather merchant. Monsieur Laurent agreed to a marriage if Jules could prove himself in the leather business. Jules worked hard, but he invested heavily in Persian leather just before a crash in the market. Monsieur Laurent's business was ruined. The wedding was cancelled. Jules suffered a mental breakdown and was sequestered in a Paris monastery. He escaped and was next seen walking the paths of this country, dressed in the clothing of his ruin. And despite appeals to return, Jules remained to complete his penance.
No end of other names have circulated in connection with the Leatherman. In his time, many claimed the Leatherman's name was of Rudolph or Randolph Mossy, though where this Mossy name originated from is unknown. James F. Rogers claimed that, in confidence, the Leatherman said his name was Isaac, or some such variety, likely a corruption of Isaac. The only written testament we have of the Leatherman's name is in the Hartford hospital records, which claim him to be a 55-year-old named Zacharias Bouvier. Where that name comes from is a mystery too, though. It is unknown if the Leatherman, Humane Society agents, or doctors themselves offered it to the records. Be it any name, it was definitely not Jules Bourglet, and many even claim the Leatherman had actually forgotten his own name over the years. Few Leatherman experts have ever been interested in the Leatherman's actual name, and it is considered the most superfluous aspect of his story. The first leatherologist, Chauncey L. Hotchkiss, was more interested in the Leatherman's maps, establishing the first documentation of Old Leathery. In 1937, Allison Albee published several articles on the Leatherman, which led to a revival of interest throughout Connecticut. This was followed by writer and cave expert Leroy W. Foote becoming the preeminent Leatherman researcher in the 1940s and later. For much of the later 1900s, the Foote family was the safeguarders of the Leatherman's legacy. Roy and his wife Shelby interviewed hundreds of people about him, those who had actually seen the vagabond as a child, and those who had family stories about him. In the 1980s, Ed McKinnon produced the excellent, though now outdated documentary, The Road Between Heaven and Hell, on the Leatherman for Connecticut Public Television. Then, through the 1990s and 2000s, Dan W. DeLuca inherited the position as the preeminent modern Leatherman scholar from the Footes, even being able to debunk the Jules Bourglet name and story. though he unfortunately passed in 2016, meaning there is no current expert on the Leatherman. Even in death, the Leatherman's wanderlust would not fade. After his passing, hunters and woodsmen traded stories about the Leatherman's ghost, claims it still haunted the roads of his trails, either protecting its treasure or simply unable to rest. Nor could even the Leatherman's grave rest. Due to dangers from a highway, in 2011, it was decided to relocate the Leatherman's body to a more appropriate area of the cemetery. It was also decided to test his remains for any DNA that could put to rest his background, decisions that met no end of controversy in the local community. Although, both were put to rest when the Leatherman's grave was opened on May 25, 2011. In it were found only rusty nails from his cheap coffin. No remains or bones. It was as if the Leatherman had simply gotten up from his grave and walked away, though the likely explanation is the area's acidic soil broke down his coffin and decaying body. With no body, the few rusted nails and some dirt were symbolically reburied in a far nicer coffin in a more prominent area of Sparta Cemetery. Removing the old Jules Bourglet Memorial, which was given over to the Connecticut Historical Society, a plaque was installed above the new grave that simply read, "The Leatherman." The Leatherman's fame is a persistent thing. It exists far beyond those who gave him meals and bread in his day. In December 1888, the Melham and Wilson Museum in New York offered the vagabond a salary and board if he would live in their showroom as an exhibit. The Leatherman obviously never responded. The folk song Leatherman 2 keeps the leather-clad wanderer alive in musical memory, directly invoking the Leatherman's death through the lines, "Across the high mountains and under the sky, I'll go back to Ossian and there will I die. Yes, I'll go back to Ossian and die." Even questioning the Leatherman's long-debated purpose with, "I cannot remember the sound of my name, or why I am clad in the animal skein. All clad in the animal skein." Even the band Pearl Jam has honored him with a more modern musical take in their eponymous 1997 song, Leatherman. Written by lead singer Eddie Vedder in 1996 during a stay in New York, where he hiked part of the Leatherman's route and inspected one of the many caves of his residence. Another attempt to immortalize the Leatherman in music. Nearly all Leatherman enthusiasts are fueled by a desire to keep the Leatherman story alive. Not to answer it, remind you, but to keep the Leatherman's journey going from person to person. Dan DeLuca's 2008 book, The Old Leatherman, Historical Accounts of a Connecticut and New York Legend, is one of the best pieces of Leatherman scholarship, the most complete account of the Leatherman ever composed with new research, and I cannot recommend it or Mr. DeLuca's work enough. Though after DeLuca's recent passing in 2016, it seems the Leatherman awaits his next great scholar. And due to his odd historical charm, the Leatherman will have one. The Leatherman never envisioned this legacy. He likely never envisioned much. But everyone loves a good chase, no matter how slow or rural the road. He is always to be followed, but never stopped. The people always knew to keep a place open for the leather-clad wanderer. And, as the Leatherman often said, thanks for the bread.
Leatherman, Leatherman, where do you go? The winds they do whistle, the winds they do blow. Yes, the winds they do whistle and blow. Leatherman, Leatherman, where do you go? The way is all frozen and laden with snow. Yes, the way is all laden.
As the winds do whistle and blow, I'd like to thank my patron, The Single Way Out.